Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for this episode of the Crexi Podcast, an insider's look at all things commercial real estate. Each week, we sit down with commercial real estate experts to uncover trends, insights, and strategies shaping the industry. I'm Shanti Ryle, Director of Content Marketing here at Crexi, and today we are very excited to sit down with Josh Wood, Senior Managing Director at Valbridge. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Shanti. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, very happy to have you here. Before we get into what is going to be a very fascinating conversation, I'm very excited about it. Let me share a little bit with our audience about who you are and what you do. So Josh is a valuation expert, educator, and adjudicator who centers his practice on the intersection of appraisal, theory, and law, which two very deep subjects that give him a rare perspective in combination on issues of all kinds of interesting property valuation, property rights issues, and just very rare instances that we will be exploring over the course of our conversation. Josh's undergraduate studies included economics, computer science, formal logic, game theory, and analytics philosophy. And he spent 2 years in a philosophy PhD program and earned his master's degree in philosophy, which is quite a pivot from computer science and economics. In 1998, he joined one of the firms that would eventually become Valbridge Property Advisors, which is the largest commercial property appraisal company in the United States. Over the course of his career, he's appraised nearly every kind of commercial property for a variety of different purposes, like bankruptcy, divorce, mortgage lending, tax appeal, construction defects, breach of contract, you name it. Josh has probably worked on that case. And while working as an appraiser, he attended law school at University of Arizona and got his Juris Doctor cum laude in 2007. During this time, he was the editor of the Law Review and participated in Moot Court, as well as published an award-winning piece on servitudes in the Law Review. After graduation, Josh expanded his appraisal practice to include expert witness testimony and consultation. He's testified in courts in Arizona and Texas, as well as in arbitration. And he joined the American Arbitration Association's panel of neutrals in 2008, where he was one of the youngest ever to join that organization. Outside of appraisal, Josh teaches, develops, and reviews educational courses and texts for the Appraisal Institute and the International Right-of-Way Association. He was a contributing author of the current 15th edition of The Appraisal of Real Estate. And I got to ask, how big is that book? 15th edition.
Big.
Yeah, it's a Mondo document. And a reviewer of the current 7th edition of the Dictionary of Real Estate Appraisal. Whew, Josh, when do you sleep? With what, 3-4 degrees of all different sorts? When do you fit that into your schedule?
I sleep whenever I get the chance to.
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. So that was a pretty comprehensive overview of your background, but seeing it on paper, it doesn't do quite the justice as hearing one story from one's own experience. So I'd love to hear briefly, what were the key decision points along your path that led you from computer science to philosophy to appraisal to law to go on?
Well, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy. I accompanied that with studying things like logic and computer science and economics while I was in college, so that everything wasn't just words and arguments, but I had some numbers to balance that all out. At the time, I thought I was going to become a college professor, so I started a PhD program. And when that didn't work out, I just had to figure out something else to do, and found myself in Tucson, Arizona without a job, and ended up working for an appraiser. My next best choice was working at the car rental desk. So I knew nothing about appraisal, but walked in with skills in writing and skills in reasoning, and quickly discovered this was a great way to make a living.
Yeah, I'm curious. So many people I talk to on this podcast do trip and fall into commercial real estate, but I feel like it's much more common to fall into becoming a broker or come join as an LP on this deal. What were your first thoughts when you entered this appraiser's office, and how did you go about building the skills you needed to learn more about the business and, just set you on this path?
Well, I didn't know very much about it at all. I probably would have recognized that there's something called appraiser that people do, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you anything about it. And certainly not that there was some difference between residential and commercial real estate, or how any of that worked. Appraisal was and is a real apprenticeship. So the way you learn it is by doing it. We had files in our office of old appraisals, and most assignments started by finding something in the files that looked like the thing that you were appraising. But the other part of it was textbooks, and the textbooks were very familiar to me coming out of the academic background. So that was one of the things that was easiest for me to connect to right away, were the textbooks, which I knew what to do with a textbook, having come out of graduate school. So I had a pen by pencil, and I attacked the current edition of the Appraisal of Real Estate the way a grad student would. And that first copy that I had was marked up and circled and argued with and underlined every page front to back. And then I discovered there were classes that she took in becoming an appraiser. And so all of that very well fit within the skill set that I had developed up to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Wait, I gotta clarify. Were there notes in the margins of the book as you were reading it for the first time, or were you the one scribbling in and attacking it with logic and reasoning?
Right. I took an empty book and wrote all over it.
You filled it in. I love it. I love it. Yeah, I feel like that's one of the best ways to learn, is kind of to argue through an assertion. It's that you're having like the Socratic method with yourself in a piece of literature. I guess not literature if it's a textbook, but it's a great way to defend your reasoning.
Absolutely. No, that's right. And I can't imagine I would still be in appraisal but for all of that.
Sure, absolutely.
Finding out that the organization that governed this profession was called the Appraisal Institute was very comfortable, recognizing that it had this connection to academy, to education, to that way of viewing the world.
Yeah. Continual scholarship for sure is a big part of it. So how, kind of in those early days, you cited your skills in academia as being a big part of your excitement about learning this industry. But how, in those early days, did you see what you had learned about logic, what you had learned about philosophy? Obviously, economics plays into it too. But do you have any early examples of kind of seeing those components apply to the cases you were working on that you could share?
Well, everything in appraisal is expected to be based on evidence and logic. So in that sense, it was very familiar. Formal logic and philosophy, analytic philosophy, start from the idea that you should be able to make your case foundationally. You start with your premises and then build logically to a conclusion where everything is demonstrable. So that's very much true in appraisal, or it ought to be true. And that ended up being one of the places that I began to explore in appraisal, were areas where maybe appraisers could do a better job of actually identifying what the evidence and the logic should be.
Sure. Yeah, I'm curious. Do you have any, you mentioned improvement. Do you have any instances, maybe early on or a little later in your career, where, I don't want to use the term favorite mistake explicitly, because mistakes in appraisal obviously have significant consequences, but were there any early lessons learned maybe after the fact? You're like, oh, I should have done this differently, or applied my reasoning a little differently, that shaped how you cut your theoretical whetstone moving forward?
So when I started the courses to get my license and to become an MAI appraiser, at that time there was no online education and there were week-long courses, so it always meant traveling somewhere. I would travel and go spend a week with some appraiser somewhere studying something, and then getting into the specific course materials. And they would be on each of the different parts of the appraisal. So there would be a course on market analysis, a course on cost approach, and whatnot. So I would come back from each of those courses with the latest guidance from the Appraisal Institute on how to do something. And so on the one hand, here I was in the office using the files that were available and just saying, okay, well, how do we come up with the right adjustment for this? What's the adjustment for age, or how do we figure out what the right vacancy is supposed to be? Then I would go to the classes. I would get some of the let's call it official guidance, official recommendations. Could come back to the office and say, hey, you know what? Here's actually what they're saying we should be doing on this. So for a few years, this became this process of being able to really gather and cite, the most up-to-date practices versus just sort of the habits that had developed over time.
Yeah, I like that idea of you have to constantly pit what you've built out in terms of experience against potentially newly emergent schools of thought, or
Exactly.
the conversation never stops happening.
It becomes an iterative feedback process, because today's best guidance will become tomorrow's habits, and then eventually to be replaced by maybe more analysis and more guidance.
Yeah. So I want to get into the law side of it too. So from a career standpoint, I'd love to hear what brought you into going to law school after working as an appraiser for, I think at that point it was maybe almost 10 years.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then following out of that, just from a school of thought perspective, the law is the law until a new law comes in to change it. Whereas appraisal and best practices sounds like it's a little bit more fluid and evolving. So how do those two mesh?
Yeah. So when I left the PhD program, my first backup idea was to go become a law school professor. So instead of teaching philosophy, I could teach law. So actually some advice that I had gotten at the time. Okay, if you're not going to teach philosophy, go teach law. The tenure's shorter and the pay is better. So I said, okay, that sounds like a good deal. Except when I looked into it a little more, I discovered that there's actually a ton of people out there trying to teach law, because all you need for it is a JD, and there's tons of people running around with their JD who don't want to practice law. They find out it's not like what it looks like on TV.
Yeah.
So if you really want to do that as a career, you really have to get a law degree from like Harvard or Yale, And so when I took my LSATs, I did good, but I didn't do Harvard, Yale good. So I just stuck it up on the shelf at that point and said, I'll do something else. Well, fast forward, by the time I'm about to get my MAI, and I was asking my mentors, what do I do now? What's next? What other things are there? What other hills are there to climb? And the response I got was, what do you mean? Now you just appraise real estate for 40 years. And I thought, God, that sounds boring. That's not, I got to have something else to do.
Yeah.
And that was the time when I realized, here I am in Tucson with a world-class law school in place I can go to in state tuition, and my LSAT scores are still good for another few months. It was really fate.
Wow. Right down to the wire there.
Yeah. And so I started law school while I was still working, and had a small child, and my son was born in the middle of law school. So I really didn't sleep in those years, but they were very exciting time. It was exactly what I wanted at that time, exactly what I was looking for. Law school became learning how everything works, because in our country, everything at the end of the day comes down to what lawyers think about it. Everything is run by, at the bottom, judges. At the end, maybe property rights even. is a question of, at the end of the day, what some judge is going to say at some point about your right.
Sure.
Every
So let's
property
get
right,
into.
every
Go
property
ahead.
right will have to be unpacked at some point to, what are you going to say a judge? What are you going to ask a judge to give you?
Yeah.
So law school became getting to understand how to figure out what the rules are for any number of things. Reminded me a
Sure.
great deal of, as a kid, playing board games, and how some people just wanted to dump out the pieces of the board game and start playing, and other kids wanted to take the back of the box and read it to figure out how it works. And
That
that
was
was
me.
me.
I was that kid. Yeah.
I liked the back of the box, and that's what law school is. It's the back of the box for everything.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the basics of the appraiser's role, especially in those cases where it does go to the courts and there's either, arbitration or anything that's more like high stakes. How does appraisal play into those scenarios? And, given that appraisal itself is an evolving process, where have you seen, the process kind of fall short of where it needed to be in a certain case? Or, how are they incorporated into that litigation process?
So appraisal is in court when there's some kind of dispute over value, usually market value. And and what's going on is the judge or the jury is going to have to essentially do an appraisal. They're going to have to come up with an opinion of value. And we appraisers show up essentially as helpers in that. So when I'm testifying, I think of myself as someone saying to the judge or jury, hey, your problem is you got to do an appraisal, and you're not an appraiser, so you don't know how to do it. I'm an appraiser. I did an appraisal already. I solved this problem, and here's how I solved it. And I'm going to invite you to solve it the same way that I did. At the end of the day, though, it's the fact finder's problem to come up with value. And so I think of myself sort of like a guide to the fact finder on it.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, this is a little sidebar, but historically speaking, when did appraisers come into play? Because I'm sure there were land dispute, value disputes for centuries. So when did the expert come in to formalize the process and teach juries or teach an arbitrator how to do that?
That's a fascinating question. That's actually really interesting, deep question. In the United States, appraisal really took off as a profession during the New Deal, when all sorts of acquisitions were going on around the country, and then even further during the highway expansion projects in the middle of the 20th century. But appraisal, the need for value opinions goes much, much farther back than that. We have records of colonial records talking about what are called appraisers, and how the appraisers were required to figure out the fair value of things. Appraisal, in that way, is just one example of the need that our society has for professions, for individuals to become expert in some field of service, personal service, where that person, that professional, is acting not in that professional's interest, but in the interest of the client. So the law and medicine and the clergy are three of the oldest professions that we invented the universities for. But appraisal falls right in line with those as well. Whereas the lawyer serves your legal rights, and the doctor serves your physical body, and clergy serves your immortal soul, the appraiser is serving property with respect to people. So everybody has these legal issues, physical issues, spiritual issues, property issues. And we need expert help in it. And we need those experts not to take advantage of us.
Mhm.
So in that
Mhm.
sense, appraisal has existed for quite a long time.
Sure.
Its real crystallization into a formal profession is really quite recent, but its
Mm.
roots run very, very deep.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and having it be that third party as opposed to some number, a process that's agreed upon between two parties that have perhaps conflicting interests,
Right.
uh,
Right.
totally makes sense. You need somebody unbiased who's done this a lot. Before we get into the processes of appraisal in different situations where it might be required, on our prep call, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about this. We had a very fascinating conversation about the etymology of the words value and worth. So I'd love to get into that a little bit and repeat some of that here. What do these words tell us about how people approach real estate and property?
Well, I love etymology. I love the history of words.
Mhm.
There's an app on the front page of my phone for to look up the etymology of words because it's. I think there's so much wisdom packed into words.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons English is so interesting is we have this dual linguistic background of the Romance languages coming out of Latin and the Germanic words. And
Mm.
so a lot of times it turns out we have one concept that we get to from two different directions, sort of the Roman direction and the Germanic direction. And they can give us really interesting perspectives on the same concept. So it's sort of like convergent evolution, different things end up flying, but for different reasons. And in the
Mhm.
same way, we can get to the meanings of words that come from different places and give us get different perspective on what it is that we're doing.
Mhm.
So value and worth is one of these etymological splits. Value comes from the Latin and focuses on the concept of strength. So when we talk about the value of something, what we're talking about is its essence. How strong is that thing? What are its inherent characteristics that make it good or bad? On the other hand, worth, which is the Germanic word, is in a family of words, of these WR words that all indicate turning or twisting. So wrist is one of those words, as is wrought
Mm.
iron, as is the
Mm.
word work itself. The idea of what happens when we put our effort into something. And so you might see this as saying, if value is the question of how is something in its essence, how is something in itself, then worth might be, well, how have we changed it or improved it, or what has our work done to the um, increase the appeal of the thing that it is that we're
Mhm.
evaluating.
Increase the value.
Well, I didn't want to say value, right? Because
Yeah, yeah.
that's the point, is that if we're going to think about value as being the inherent thing, then worth is
Mhm.
something on top of that. And
Yeah.
there's sort of a acute parallel that hits our appraisal methodology, which is when we do highest and best use of an improved property being something we've worked on, something we've turned from its original
Mhm.
direction into some direction that suits us.
Mhm.
We can say our first stage, when we say, what's its value as if vacant? That's a value question. And
Mhm.
then when we say, well, what's its value as is, given the program of utilization that's been turned to? That's a worth
Yeah.
question. And so
Mm.
etymologically, we have these twin ideas of
Sure.
what is it that we talk about when we talk about appraisal of something. We are interested in both of these ideas. We're interested in that inherent value, and we're also interested in the worth that we bring to the inherent value.
Yeah. And I mean, I won't go too down this philosophical rabbit hole, but it speaks to what is the, well, worth of somebody improving something, of a person making their mark upon something that already existed and does that have a number that can be hooked onto it? At what point in the conversation are each of these different levers more or less weighted in making these calculations? I think it's very interesting that both terms are used in the formal appraisal process.
That's right.
That's very, very interesting. So let's just get into appraisal, period. So a lot of people know it's involved in the valuation process. I think some people consider it to be, kind of cloistered off. You go behind a curtain, you move an abacus around, and then you emerge, and here's the number. But what does a typical appraisal process look like in the world of commercial real estate? And then we can get more into the specifics of all the crazy, unusual, specific cases that you've worked on.
Well, there are 3 classic approaches to value that are considered in every assignment. We look at very, very briefly, cost approach, sales comparison approach, income approach. Cost approach is what does it cost to build it? Sales comparison approach is what other ones sell for. And income approach is what's this thing worth if I rent it out? That's a very brief explanation of each of the 3 primary ways we look at the value of property. Yeah. But fundamentally, when we talk about market value, and this applies to all of the approaches to value, the real question that we're asking is, what's a comp? And the decision about which of the approaches to use or which to rely on is a question of which of these ways of gathering comps or potential comps turns out to be the most credible way of coming up with it.
Sure. And is that different in a case-by-case basis, or how do you usually approach that problem?
Absolutely. It's a question of, it really is a question of the market. It's a question of market analysis. It's the appraiser's job to listen to market data and wait for the market data to tell you what's going on. There are certainly, for certain property types, you're going to be more likely to look at one approach versus another. For instance, an apartment project, ordinarily, you would like to rely on the income capitalization approach, because most of the time, people are going to buy and sell them largely based on the income that they produce. But that's not always the case. And if the market scenario doesn't tell you that, or if you're dealing with a fact scenario where you don't have the good ability to determine the income characteristics of that property for some reason, then you might tend to rely more on other approaches to value. All the time trying to figure out what's a comp.
Yeah. I'm curious, have there been any strange cases where you've had to kind of Frankenstein different methodologies together to arrive at a valuation estimate? Or and is there anything that comes to mind where you're like, there was no data, this market was going through some weird stuff, so couldn't rely on necessarily what was happening because maybe the data was changing too quickly? I'm curious, how have you had to adapt in unusual circumstances?
Yeah, great question. The more plentiful the data, the easier it is to appraise something, and the less data you have, the harder it is.
Sure.
So, if you're appraising a house and 3 other houses on the street sold and they were built around the same time and they're about the same size, that's not going to be a very challenging assignment. But if you've got something that basically never sells, now what are you going to do? Every one of the approaches to value at the heart depends on sales for it. You can't really do the cost approach without having sales, because you don't know how much depreciation there is in something without the sales to it. And you can't really do an income approach without sales, because you don't know what the cap rate is without the sales. Everything comes back to sales.
Sales meaning the last sale of the property or similar property, or?
Yeah, a sale of a similar property.
Sure.
So if you don't have the things that are most directly similar, now you have to start expanding. And that's why I said, fundamentally, the question of appraisal is what's a comp? Because that's when you don't have the obvious comps, that's where it becomes an interesting analysis to do, an interesting problem to solve. So I'm going to have to widen the scope in terms of how many years I look back, or the geography I look to, or maybe even how similar of a property type am I going to look at. And it becomes a trade-off. How am I going to trade that off? If I'm appraising property in Houston, would I rather go back 3 more years, or would I rather look at other metropolitan areas in Texas? That sort of thing. If I'm appraising an apartment property, would I be willing to look at senior housing apartment properties, or should I stay just on apartment properties and go to a different geography? These are the trade-offs that appraisers have to tread through in assembling, for every assignment, the answer to the question, what's a comp? The collection of, this is what I believe to be the most similar data to answer this question, to solve the problem in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, that valuation is critical in the real estate transaction process for financing, for, you know, pricing in the market, for all sorts of parts of how this industry works. So from a typical perspective, appraisals are very, very important. But in atypical scenarios, they're obviously just as important, if not more so. So from the litigation appraisal side of things, I know we talked a little bit about how you consider your role in the courtroom as that of an advisor to the jury that ultimately has to decide, or the judge that has to decide on the final number. I'm curious, you know, getting back into the philosophy of it all, or perhaps just basic legal frameworks. Are there any interesting cases that come to mind that were brought to the courtroom that either hinged on like the interpretation of valuation, or like just anything that comes to mind that was more complex than maybe a simple arbitration case would be, and what made that that issue interesting to you?
Well, there's it's not unusual that a case turns on something definitional. We have the whole appraisal profession has been struggling for some time now over the definition of fee simple, and courts have struggled hard over trying to understand the meaning of this as it applies in the appraisal world.
What is fee simple for our audience?
Fee simple is a way of owning real estate, and it's the way most real estate is owned in the Western world. And it really it means that you have all of the rights to the property forever and ever. And when you die, it either passes to whoever you told it to pass to in your will, or it passes to your heirs if you don't have a will. That is to say, it never goes back to anybody else. And that's unlike a lease or a life estate that has a recognized end period and a recognized person to whom the property goes. So fee simple, when it developed in the Middle Ages, it was this revolutionary concept that now, instead of the property going back to the king when the knight died, it would stay with the knight forever and ever. The property rights used to be a way that the kings and the nobles would bind themselves together in their relationships. William the Conqueror conquered England and got all the land, but now he needed to run it. Now he needed to manage it. And how was he going to manage it? Well, he managed it by taking all the land and doling it out to his lords, and the lords were going to give him back service. And then the lords needed to do the same thing iteratively. Now they had all this land that they had to take care of. They needed service for it, and so on. So the original idea was, we're going to have this relationship. You're going to come swear me loyalty, and in return, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of land. And so if you're the king and I swear my loyalty to you and I get the land, that's a relationship between you and me. And if I die, you might want to have that new relationship with my son, but he's going to have to show up and swear loyalty to you personally before it becomes attached to him. That was how land was held for a very long time, in these personal contingent relationships. And when somebody died, it was over. Fee simple was this fascinating revolution in ownership of land where the king said, I'm going to give it up and I'm never going to get it back. And that's what we have today. Now, of course, fee simple is subject to things like the ability for the government to tax you and to take it for eminent domain and whatnot. But absent that, it really is this little picture of the old expression that every man's home is his castle. We are the Lord. The property comes back to us at the end of the day. So anyway,
I love that. A little history lesson.
Fee
So
simple,
bringing it back to the courtroom.
fee simple. At somewhere along the lines, appraisers started focusing on how you needed to pay attention to how the fee simple could get encumbered by things, leases, mortgages, whatnot. It's actually one of the great things about the fee simple is that we can encumber it. So the fact that you can take your fee simple interest to the bank and borrow money against it is one of the best things about real estate. One of the great things about real estate is it gives me access to debt. And you might think, well, debt's bad. No, debt's good if you use it properly. That's where you get leverage. How many of us are living in houses that we could have bought if we had to buy them for cash? Very few of us. The world will look very different if we couldn't mortgage our houses. So there's all sorts of interest that can be placed on a fee simple. This becomes a problem if you're a lender trying to understand, well, what is this interest that is securing the debt? I need to know exactly what it is that I'm getting back if I have to foreclose on this property. And if you think about some kinds of commercial property, if I got a shopping center, for instance, if that shopping center has a bunch of tenants in it, it's going to be worth a lot more than an empty shopping center that I have to go put people back into. I've got to go lease up again. So we needed a vocabulary as appraisers to be able to say, well, I'm not just talking about the land and the improvements, but I'm talking about a functional investment of this property. What kind of language are we going to use to distinguish between the functional, full operating shopping center and the one that's physically identical but has nobody in place and isn't paying any money? Because they're not worth the same. And they shouldn't be worth the same. It wouldn't make sense to say that they're worth the same. Unfortunately, we decided to use the same word for it and call it fee simple. And say that the empty one, call the empty one fee simple and the full one leased fee. Something else, something different than a fee simple. And because that's stuck, we've ended up with a confusion. And now you have people who want to argue that, well, the only thing being taxed is the fee simple interest, and fee simple means vacant. So therefore, when I appeal the taxes on my property, this should be valued as if it's a vacant building.
Sure.
And the problem with that is there's some properties that it doesn't really make a difference if they're occupied or not. Think about it. A single family house is normally not, whether or not it's occupied, whether or not it's leased, isn't really going to tell you anything about the value of that property. But if a shopping center is vacant, that means something went wrong. Shopping centers just don't go vacant, right? So there's some properties that if they are vacant, that's already a signal that the value has gone down. So in other words, the vacancy is itself an indicator of the value of the property. So that's not true in a house, but it's true for a lot of properties. And caveat to that, it might not be true for a house, but it could be true for a neighborhood. So if you went to look at a house for sale, it wouldn't necessarily bother you whether it was occupied or empty. But if every house on the street was empty, you would say, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right?
Either that or it's a new development.
Wrong. Something's wrong. Right? That itself, the mere fact that the whole neighborhood was vacant would tell you something about the property. And it's the same thing with commercial property. So that's been one that we have really tangled over in the law and value space for some years, for longer than we should have been tangling with it, honestly.
It's still an issue, or you think you're close to a
it is
resolution?
Still a very big issue.
Yeah, I bet in Texas where they have to, is it every year that they put out new tax rates per county?
Texas is one of the states that revalues every year.
Yeah. So I'm sure there's plenty of projects for you to be working on when that comes around. The landlords are trying to appeal their taxes. Um, so you not just worked as an expert witness, but you've also done arbitration work, making the decision, acting as the judge in questions of valuation. So I'd love to get a little peek behind the curtain. Obviously, no name any specific cases, but what is that process like for you? And what factors are at play in your mind as you're listening to both sides and you make your decisions in these situations?
Well, it's a very different role. And
Yeah.
we tend to recognize in appraisal two primary jobs that appraisers do as
Mm-hmm.
appraisers. So you can get hired as an appraiser to give an opinion of value, and you can also get hired as an appraiser to give an opinion of another appraiser's work. We call the opinion of value an appraisal. We call the other opinion an appraisal review. These are both recognized appraiser tasks under USPAP, and they have standard rules that apply to them. You might think, okay, if I'm going to be an arbitrator, if I'm going to be a judge, I'm doing an appraisal review. Because here I am, an appraiser, and I'm going to be listening to appraisers argue, and I'm going to be forming opinions of what they do. That's not true. That's not right. I'm not doing an appraisal review assignment when I listen to a case.
Sure.
I'm doing something completely different. I'm adjudicating a case, and I need to follow the rules of that procedure, which do not involve me doing my own appraisal or me doing an appraisal review. So what am I doing? I am listening to the evidence that's presented by the sides, and I am concluding to who did the most convincing job of presenting their case. I have to refrain from giving my opinion of value. I have to refrain from doing an appraisal. I also have to refrain from giving an opinion of an appraisal review. I'm to resolve a case in a certain way is not to form an opinion of that appraiser's work. It's to determine, in that case, it's to determine who presented the better evidence.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I'm sure it's tricky to hold back. Well, maybe I would have done this calculation this way.
It takes discipline to
Yeah.
make sure that you're focused very clearly on what mental tasks you're engaging in. Make sure that you are not performing an appraisal. You're not forming your opinion based on how you think you would have appraised it, but rather you are listening to the presentation of the evidence and evaluating how that evidence is both put forward in direct examination and how it's crossed.
Yeah.
So I also can't say, oh, a better cross-examination would have raised this point and that point.
Sure. I'm curious, I know you just said you're not making judgments, so to speak, on the quality of the arguments, but I'm sure there's a lot of our listeners that are so curious what makes for a compelling, well-presented case and argument in arbitration cases. Like, just generally speaking, do you have any recommendations of like what evidence should you bring to the table? Are there any potholes you find people accidentally falling through in these cases? I'm curious what you've seen and what you'd recommend.
Well, every appraisal is supposed to be a persuasive document, right? Every appraisal, you ought to be convinced as you read through it. One of the tests I use for myself in drafting an appraisal and in creating the narrative for it is that I'd like to imagine as a reader, as they're reading through my appraisal, that before I even gave them the final number, in their head, they're already anticipating it. So they're turning the pages and saying, oh, I bet it's $1 million. I bet it's $1 million. I bet it's $1 million. And then they turn the last page and see the number and go, that's exactly what I thought it was going to be. That's the mental space I'd like to get my reader into in terms of being persuasive. One of the fascinating things about appraisal is that there are so many different markets and assets that it's impossible to say this is the one process to do an appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is always about trying to figure out what is the right evidence to muster in this context, in this particular case.
Sure.
I can give you some examples of some of the things that are most often overlooked by appraisers.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the biggest ones to me is the presentation of data in a comparable sales approach. Appraisers will often say, these are the best sales. But we don't have a very good story about what's the background context of them. Where did you,
Mm-hmm.
these are 5 sales, say, but we know, if we're talking about an apartment complex, that there have been dozens of sales. Help walk me through what makes these 5 the 5 most similar sales. This goes back to part of the problem about our habits versus our precise ways, the precise ways that are starting to develop of how we can work, because appraisal emerged out of an environment where data was very scarce. So even being able to find 5 sales was something of an achievement, say, in a world not just pre-internet, but say pre-telephone, when the only way that you got a sale was walking down to the courthouse and looking up what was there, or walking around to brokers and asking them what they knew about. So we have as I'm calling them, habits or traditions of doing things that might not be consistent with a modern space where, say, you have CoStar or other sources of data that now dump piles of data on you. And the problem isn't scarcity, but it's overabundance. And I think appraisers could do a better job of laying out the universe of data before finding the particular ones. Or
sure. How do
or
you
thinking about them
recommend?
as the priors, really.
Yeah.
We've I think there's a lot we could be taking from a Bayesian view of probability over a frequentist view. So the Bayesians tell us that we should think about the world in terms of the priors, and then how does the evidence move our priors. And I would like to see appraisal move in that direction. We're able to say things like, okay, the appraisal assignment is for an apartment building. And once you've told me it's an apartment building, I already have a distribution in mind of what do apartment buildings sell for. And now you're going to start giving me factors. You're going to start telling me things about it that's going to start modifying my priors in some way. So it's an apartment building in Texas. Let's change my priors. It's in Houston. It's an affordable housing project. It was built in the last 5 years. And so each of these ways that we add something to the picture takes our prior expectation about what's the distribution that we would expect it to sell for and narrows it until enough data points give us a nice predictable distribution of where the value should be.
Yeah.
That sort of way of thinking is the way I hope appraisal starts to move, and I think will make for much more persuasive appraisals than where we are now. If
It's like
if
sculpting.
sculpting is a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Right now, oftentimes in an appraisal dispute, we're faced with 2 appraisals that might use 2 totally different sets of data, and the reader of them has no way to really understand, is either one of these a reasonable representation of what is the
Sure.
likely distribution of sales for this, prices for this.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. Methodology is so important. I was just talking with a colleague actually about this, about how you can go to all these different brokerage shops. Here's their market reports on XYZ market, office, retail, whatever. And the numbers will generally be kind of close, but definitely not the same. And they all have different definitions for market and submarket boundaries. They have different definitions for class A versus class B, class C. There's not really, the way there are in other financial markets, a set of standards that commercial real estate universally, I feel like, adheres to.
That's
which is
absolutely
interesting.
true,
Yeah.
Shanti. And more than that, often our regional pockets don't even recognize that the way that they use terms is not a standard across the entire
Mm,
country. And
yeah.
that's very interesting, where um, somebody will hold forth on a particular topic and then find out, oh no, this actually has nothing to do with how people do it anywhere else in the country.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good gold standard to move towards, I think. I don't know when we'll get there as an industry, but I mean, something nice about working at a tech company is, we're providing data as more and more data becomes accessible, and methodologies become more transparent. You can move towards that more, maybe not pure universal, but more universal truth. And, the more exchange flows across these different regions, uh, you're going to have to start all meeting each other on a more level playing field, in terms of what terms meet what, and
Absolutely. It's
yeah, how things are calculated.
the understanding of how what commercial real estate is as an investment has changed dramatically in a
Mm-hmm.
relatively short period of time. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't long ago that all commercial investment was considered so speculative that it wasn't appropriate to be investment grade property. And
Mm.
and that's, you can understand why that would be the case if we
Yeah.
didn't have um, the availability of data for it. If
Of comps.
everything, if comps if everything was a
Yeah.
big secret.
Yeah. No, I mean, that actually is a really great segue into where the future of appraisal is going. I think, yeah, it is quite crazy. I think when I joined Crexi was around the time there was a lot of dialogue about, we're not just an alternative asset class anymore. Commercial real estate is now the fourth asset class coming on, as an actual reliable investment grade vehicle. And, with all these new technologies coming to market, with AI coming online, I'm so curious, what are the things you are most closely watching from a technology perspective? And how do you think things like AI, like technology and data availability more broadly, will impact the property valuation space?
AI is going to change everything. That was AI is one of the things I was working on back in the 90s when I was in college.
Mm,
And then one of the things I wrote about then, the possibility of true artificial intelligence. And while I
mm,
remain convinced that machines aren't going to become intelligent in the way that humans are, there's no question that the power of what artificial intelligences are going to be able to do, can do already, is dramatically transformative. And we're going to have to do a lot of work culturally to figure out how do we adjust to having these entities as part of our personal and professional lives.
mm.
Used properly, though, extraordinarily
Yeah.
powerful, and will. I mean, I think one of the things they're going to do for appraisers is magnify the amount of work a single appraiser can do, which means
Mm,
probably we're not going to see a great increase in the number of appraisers. In fact, we will probably likely continue to see a decline in the number of people who are appraisers.
mm,
The same decline that's essentially been going on my entire career, that there's fewer and fewer
mm.
people around every year doing the job.
Why do you think that is?
Largely
Just
technology,
competition?
because
Mm,
when I started in appraisal, when we were getting ready to put out a report, it was like a barn raising. Everybody had to stop what they were doing and come to the conference room, and we would
mhm,
assemble by hand these appraisal reports, which would get inserted into the binders, and each comp page had to be highlighted to outline the particular parcel that you were talking about.
mm,
And today, that doesn't happen. Many appraisals never get printed out. Right? They just go from one person's computer to another person's computer.
hmm.
So we are. My entire career has been one long technological crunch towards greater individual appraiser efficiency, and so even if there's more volume of work to be done, fewer and fewer appraisers can do that same amount of work.
Do you think it's existential at all for your sector? Or, I mean, it's both art and science, right? Because again, you have to make the logical, compelling case for this is my valuation, this is me defending my thesis. And, I do think AI will get to that point where it can defend its argument in numbers and has, much faster access to way more data than I imagine an average analyst could comb through. But do you think it'll ever fully replace the human element if you do have to really sell why that number?
I don't think so. But it's not an obvious reason why. I've written about that in Valuation magazine. We could have a whole other. You can have me come back and we can talk for another hour on that.
Yeah.
I think it's a fascinating issue to think about. And like I said, the reasons why I think no, it's not going to do what we do. They're complicated, so it's hard to even get into them briefly.
Sure.
I will say though that there's lots of the supporting work that AI will be able to do that will really speed up appraiser activity, and AI will be able to do a very good job of pretending to do what it is that appraisers have to do, and that's part of the risk. There is that not part of the risk. I think that's the true risk. That and the hallucinations. The hallucinations people are talking about, what people aren't talking about is the way AI will be able to fake it so well that most people won't know that it's not a person behind it. And that's the scarier stuff.
Yeah. I think to me, at the end of the day, people, especially in the world where millions and sometimes billions of dollars are trading hands, I think they want to trust a person. And human beings are fallible, certainly. But if you don't know what you don't know, how do you know if this machine knows it or doesn't know it?
Well, I'll give you. I said it's too complicated to talk about, but I'll give you a little hint of that picture. So remember that the fundamental question in appraisal is what's a comp, and that sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it's just a matter of, okay, here's a house in this neighborhood and a bunch of them nearby have sold, so let's crank that through. That one you might think AI might be able to do that one pretty well, but stick a pin in that. We'll come back to that in just a second. But now think about the harder one where there's not obvious sales, and now I'm going to have to start expanding out my envelope a little bit more. But how do I know whether to do it by geography or use or date of sale?
That's where the creativity comes in.
Yeah, and it's I would call it the framing of it. So understanding how to frame the problem, how to identify what of the entire universe is relevant in this particular case. That's what algorithms can't do. So algorithms can do very well at running down a task, even one with a lot of options to it. That's why the chess machine beats me all the time, right? Because it can run down all of those options. It doesn't really understand what it is to pin the queen, right? It doesn't know that as a maneuver to pull off. But what it can do is consider billions of possibilities very quickly. But there are way more options in real estate than there are moves on a chessboard. And the AI can prevail on the chessboard because even though it's a big number, there's a limited number of things to possibly consider. Okay, now back to that pin that we just stuck where you think, okay, maybe it can do the houses. Maybe it can pull off the houses. You may know that, so you've heard of Zillow, of course, that purports to be able to value essentially every house in the country. And at one point, they decided, look, if we know what the value of all these houses are, we should be taking advantage of this. We should be investing on this basis. And in fact, they did do that and then lost an incredible amount of money. So even when Zillow got to pick which investments they made, it was a disaster for them. So perhaps one day we'll be able to get to that point that the machines do a good enough job valuing that we can sort of sit back and click a button and watch the real estate profits come in.
Yeah.
But right now, that's not the case.
Yeah. Ugh, yeah, I have a lot more thoughts on this, but I know I want to be mindful of time. We're running up on the clock here. Josh, this has been so much fun. I want to ask you just one last thing before we let you go. Appraisal is an apprenticeship, is something you said early on in our conversation. What advice would you give to the would-be apprentices in the world of appraisal? Or more broadly speaking, anybody who's looking to strengthen their skill at valuation and understanding the worth of properties?
That's a great question, Shanti. And my kids are in their early 20s and are struggling to figure out where do they fit in places. And that's I think this is a hard question. I empathize with people who are trying to figure out where do I fit in? What's a place that I can how do I connect? How do I contribute? How do we be part of this? So be realistic and recognize the space that you're trying to get into. Ask yourself, how do I add value? So if you're committed, if you want to be an appraiser, you want to be in this profession that probably has a declining number of people who are going to be in it. What is it that's going to make you stand out and contribute in a way that you're going to be part of what comes next? It's so it's not about if you do the work and show up, there'll be space there for you, but it's about what can I bring to this space, to this profession. And the good news is there's plenty that you can if you understand who appraisers are and what we're stuck in. So where our conversation has got to just now about this AI, appraisers everywhere know AI is going to be transformative. Appraisers are mostly older people who are not maybe the most comfortable with technology. But even if they are, they're very busy and they haven't had the time to learn it and really embrace it. Even an appraiser who tells you, "Oh, I'm not taking on apprentices, I'm too busy," could maybe be persuaded to connect with somebody who was able to open up that path for them.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's true too of any entry commercial real estate position, to be honest with you.
what can you bring
doesn't.
to the table, and then be realistic about what you're going to get paid at the beginning, because you're not actually going to be bringing much at the beginning, so you need to be realistic about how much you're going to get paid at the beginning. But if you're committed, if you really want to be an appraiser and you really want to go that direction, maybe what you should find a way to make less money at the beginning and more later on.
Gotta prove your worth. Add value. There's those words. That's going to be your tagline. Josh, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate you spending the time with us. We finally got this conversation in the can. I know we had to schedule it a few times. Where can people connect with you if they want to get in touch, learn more about, your work, appraisal in general, things like that? How can they reach out?
I'm active on LinkedIn, and you can find me by searching my name.
Perfect.
Putting in something about appraiser, you'll find me.
Yeah. Josh Wood. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Really, really enjoyed it. Shanti, thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And thank you everyone who tuned in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For our full rotation of episodes and show notes, you can visit crexi.com/podcast to see all of the episodes we've had so far. And you can also check out our YouTube channel for video versions of each and every episode. Take care and be sure to tune in next time.